On the second panel, I am Matěj Pavlík, and I will be hosting the second panel. I would like to introduce to you the first guest of the panel, or first panelist. Mention couple of words, or brief information on Kateřina Lišková. Kateřina Lišková is focusing on the issues of sexuality and sex from the feministic point of view. She spent a couple of years at Columbia University, New York, and Technische Universität in Berlin. She's also an author of Sexual Liberation, Socialist, Sexual Liberation, Socialist Style, Communist Czechoslovakia, and the Science of Desire book. Now I would like to give her the floor, and thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much for introduction. Thank you for coming from the topic of parenthood and bringing up children. Let's have a look at the sexual liberation in the same environment. The year of 1968 means sexual liberation equals sexual liberation, both in the Czech Republic and eastward of Iron Curtain. It really looked quite differently because the sexual liberation happened much earlier. For example, the abortion was liberalized, legalized, and the orgasm started to be discussed in the atmosphere for stressing the equality of women. During the 70s and 80s, the expertise, the discourses were quite contradicting because women were supposed to look for the proper position within the household. The good sex was supposed to verify good marriage. Based on the archival materials, I will show you how Czechoslovak experts, be it sexologists, demographists, and many others, were consulting and advising the state concerning how marriage, family, and how they co-created the intimate life of men and women. The Institute of Sexuology is the oldest public institution focusing on sexuality of human beings. It's a public institute because since 1921 it was part of Charles University, public institution. Established in Berlin, was a better known institution, but that was private owned. The Czech Institute on Sexuology Institute was a public one since 1945, after the liberation and after the end of the Second World War. They focus on exploring the issues of sex. It is quite interesting that this particular institution was never abolished by the communists, so people who focused on social, family issues, sex issues, such institutes were not very common in the Eastern Bloc, whilst this institution was working for the whole existence of socialist state. there was a society, sexology society established, and Ministry of Healthcare also started to issue binding legislation, and this institute became integral part of healthcare. What was written about in books on marriage, so books on marriage published back in 50s informed people about body, about how the body works. It was put in the context of society. Mr. Barták, Dobiasz, and Medoba. This particular book you can see on the slide is there is quite frequently mentioned the fact that women should participate on work, and they were also focusing on terminating inequality social-wise, and marriage should be based on mutual love. And the love was supposed to be the only reason for marrying each other. No economic imperatives. Men and women were supposed to meet as friends, as equal, whose shared interests will become a real love, will turn into a real love. They were supposed to be equally interested or equally participated on work. The authors were writing about the past marriage in the following way: only poor women, working class, have participated in working process, but they could only work at the lowest levels at the factories and fields. At the same time, they were more exploited than men, whilst woman in a bourgeois marriage, she was supposed to focus on housework and upbringing of children. The freedom of will of men was was implemented, whilst the woman's one could not. Such marriage became quite frequently a jail for woman, because she didn't have so many freedoms as men. So again, there was two standards of marriages, whilst with the socialism, the situation was supposed to change significantly in favor of women. And here I quote again: marriage is more equal because people are meeting at the same levels. The partners meet as equal, free citizens, and that is possible only under socialism, which is freeing the woman. The main difference is in the position of woman. Class and gender was reformed at the same time. How sexuality is perceived in this context. The authors stress deep sense, deep feelings, because without deep feelings, sex could not be as fruitful to both. Good sex is better for men and women who are equal. This was supported by research. The sexologist carried out the first research on orgasm. Women who could not get pregnant were cured at Františkovy Lázně, and the doctors were wondering why 9% of women do not have any symptoms to and have no reason to not be able to become pregnant. As the gynecologist at Františkovy Lázně invited sexologists from Prague, and they have implemented a research where they had 500 women who could not become pregnant, and another 100 of women who were fertile, actually were already pregnant. They were asking lots of questions concerning the class they come from, concerning the origin, provenance, the mutual relationship with husbands, etc. The infertile women were sexually not satisfied and are not that much in love with their husbands and don't feel to be loved. They quite frequently mentioned as the reason of getting married, they wanted to leave their parents. Maybe they were not so sure about the partner. Simply they wanted to marry. They were not mentioning love, the right socialistic reasons, which was supposed to be basis of the marriage. Sexologists then concluded that it's the absence of love which makes women infertile. It actually predetermines the women to be infertile. Concerning this particular research, we should also mention one more fact, and it's the role of orgasm necessary for the conception. At the end of the 40s, beginning of 50s, the doctors were discussing whether the woman orgasm also participates on the conception. They came to the conclusion that it has a certain importance. This is the reason why the women's orgasm was being actually researched on whether it is one of the reasons of infertility. Idea of mutual equality is important and typical for the 50s. Having a look at the end of a long 50 years, the beginning of 61, there was a conference held on the top. The main topic was female orgasm. In case you wouldn't know the context in which the following quotations were mentioned, you could think this was the second wave of Western feminism. Jiřina Knoblochová, for example, said, woman, one of her typical patients, is not satisfied in her sexual life, but it's primarily because she does not understand her husband. Her husband does not pay sufficient attention, and he leaves all the work at home upon her. Knoblochová was advising it's better to support a woman so she can have a job, so she can have an employment, and she avoids isolation and being overloaded by housework. They have agreed there is no way back for women. Employment of women is an important part of socialism. It's not emancipational thing of a woman. When we were talking, what are the reasons for the absence of orgasm, Mrs. Knoblochová was of the idea that it's also due to a technique, sexual technique, but it's also due to alienation and conflict. Through alienation and conflict in the partnership leads to the orgasm. So she was warning. She was warning that she was of the opinion that the improvement of the sexual technique can't have any improvement, any impact on the orgasm. If we have a look into the 70s, into the normalization period, we can see how dramatically it was the situation was perceived. The overlapping of intimacy of life, public life, are completely lost. Back in the 1970s, a book, Young Marriage, was published and became very, very popular because the first edition also had explicit illustrations concerning sexual techniques that should be used during the sexual intercourse. The next editions did not have these illustrations included anymore. This book is written in completely different way in comparison with the books from the 50s. Authors present the warning examples of particular couples are definitely giving a whole range of advice to the readers.
When sexologists, on one hand, are against the traditional form of marriage. They said over centuries, marriage was based on unequal position of men and women. That sounds similar to what the authors talked about in the 50s. When the book talked about the importance of equality in all areas of life. However, as you can see, in the minds of people in 20 and or 30 years, opinions on roles of men and women can change dramatically. What about the idea of basic roles of both sexes? Is it as you can see, there are many ambivalent points here. And about the impossibility of change, and maybe these changes may be undesirable. Sexologists at that time provide advice how to choose a spouse for marriage. They consider it ideal that partners come from the same class, similar social environment. And on the other hand, they should at the same time they should be at the same social and cultural level. That also concerns intelligence. If that's not the case, there may be problems. In the patriarchal system of a family, men should be more intelligent than women. If the situation is opposite, it may lead to neurosis for various cases. In men, a woman may be dissatisfied for a long period of time. Also, sexually is dissatisfied. As you can see, these positions bring sexual dissatisfaction to women. Sexual and social roles are such at this time. Sexologists Milan and Shipova realized that people can organize their lives differently, and they balance their work and family life in different ways. However, what happens if it is a woman who has a more responsible public job, and then is automatically in a dominant position in the household? Then she becomes a dominant element. If she's not led by her husband, she does not feel well in her skin. Such marriages cannot be helped, according to sexologists. When we look at how marriage should look, what it should look like, let's look at the so-called deviant sexuality. First, again, I will compare the 1950s and then the normalization time. Sexualization. Start in the as a field was as a discipline was reflected in the laws from 1950s. You can see that sexology. I'm sorry. I have to speak a bit slower because of the translators, so I will have to skip something. I probably won't talk about the deviations because we won't have enough time for this. It has already been 15 minutes now, so I should have 30 minutes total. It has already been 25 minutes now. As I said, sexuology since the beginning focused on the forensic apparatus. In the 1950s, sexuology did not deal at all with sexual deviation. The new the penal code from 1950 punished the homosexual relationship or intercourse between adults and also punished homosexual prostitution. However, did not punish zoophilia. It was not part of this penal code. And what remained in it, though, was the focus on of human dignity, which reflected the ideas from the 1950s. Prostitutes were considered antisocial types of people who did not want to work. In terms of homosexual prostitutes, the situation was even worse because based on forensic experts and doctors, they were often heterosexual and they used their homosexual victims and they tragically impacted their life histories. In the 1950s, there was, for example, a 15-year-old boy had homosexual intercourse and got paid for it. So this case was discussed at the court. The sexologists did not like the fact that such an intercourse usually morally damages young people. They get used to an easy profit, and that in the 1950s, the category the social sexual intercourse with the animals was left out. However, it was still perceived as a pathological matter. In the 1960s, a farmer from an organized agricultural unit was sticking a fork in the cow's butt, and that was the way he was satisfied in his sexual life. The cows were owned by the state, and those were the questions of work and ownership besides sexual sphere. As you can see, sexual deviation came in various forms, and this is the way it was addressed by this penal code. In normalization, in the 1970s, a new deviant started to be called a sexual delinquent. Who is this type of person? At the beginning, sexologists did not define such a person through the acts or behavior. However, they defined them as people who needed to be treated they were considered to be deviant or respectable delinquent, and that's why they needed treatment. These patients, under the SOL acronym, were usually sexual deviants who did not want to cooperate and were hostile. Their approach was very often negative. They did not want to be treated. Only 25% of them wanted to be treated. Another 25% admitted they were sexual deviant, and 50% of the patients were not critical at all, denied their deviation and criminal offenses. We see we have a lot of men here who did not feel like did not feel deviant, even though they were told by the doctors that they were. These patients were very disobedient, and however, sexologists did not find any problems in their approach to work. They had no absence at work. They came to work regularly. However, they usually lacked partnership or skills. They were not able to establish a relationship with a woman. All of these men were heterosexual. There were no homosexuals among them. Those were really heterosexual men who simply were not able to establish and maintain a relationship. How did the sexologists treat them? They introduced a 3-month treatment program that was not specific. There was group therapy in it. Patients wrote their diaries, followed TV news in the evenings together, and every 2 weeks they were invited to dances where in Horní Bečkovice and other psychiatric hospitals where they saw women from the hospital, and they were supposed to learn to establish interpersonal relationships with women, with female patients. According to the doctors, this treatment was successful. In the majority of patients, it had a positive impact on reinforcement of ethical norms and skills. It brought the first kind of experience of this kind to many of the patients. So now they finally learned something about family and about partnership. As you can see, in the 1950s and deviance in the 1950s, there was a problem in work, and in their, however, family life was not a problem for them. In the 1970s, work was not a problem, family was. Between the 1950s and 1970s, as you can see, there was a shift in accent. Why? As we can describe 3 reasons. There were socio-demographic changes, political changes, and also institutionalization of sexuology is quite important, according to me. When we look at a beautiful table of socio-demographic changes, we can see something happened in the area of marriages and divorces. There were fewer marriages, and however, many more divorces, and in political level, there was a certain disagreement because it was not in line with the family as the main important cornerstone of the state. In 1957, women women went to hospitals to get abortion, there were political changes in 1960s and especially after 1968. I think I don't need to repeat how 1968 turned out. And after the end of this year, with the beginning of normalization, there was a new focus on family. The government, at its first meeting of the Communist Party in 1971, agreed that family is important, and besides the economic changes, family was the only aspect that was supposed to be changed in normalization. And there were new social and political measures. Maternity leave was extended. There were higher child allowances and also marriage loans were increased. All of these changes were defined in the 1970s before the end of Prague Spring as part of the reforms that we know as Prague Spring. Economic changes were defined, including this pro-family package, like higher child allowances, new marriage loans, and so on. These changes were defined by experts during the Prague Spring, and those were the only changes formulated by the Prague Spring. President Husak regime formulated them under these specific political conditions. Sexuology as a field, as I said, had existed in this country already for a long time. However, in the 1970s, it was. And besides the fact that sexologists that had their own institute, they also got their own section in the medical association. Then the concept of sexology was defined to then also care for sexual deviance was defined. So it was defined who is problematic, who are the problematic men, and for them places in psychiatric hospitals were found, and this was one of the measures that led to the position of sexology as a new field of expertise.
A manželé.
Summary: deviants and husbands. Back in the 50s, deviants were individuals who were harming the ethic of work and national economy. At the same time, husband and ideal marriage was a gender equal partnership, equal class-wise. They could marry each other without respect to the class origin. Marriage was part of society. Was in the 70s, deviants were groups of men who did not comply with the society and authority, and therefore not able to live the family life, while marriages, husband and wives, ideally, were in hierarchical position gender-wise, and were supposed to be equal class-wise with the same social background. And what is greatest importance, the family was privatized, where someone can lead their own life without the interference of the state. But on the other hand, the state interfered significantly through social policy, social packages, including the child benefits, by which they supported the families. Whoever wants to know a little bit more, this is the book I've published. Thank you for your attention. So thank you very much for the presentation. Now it's the best time to ask questions. If you have any, feel free to ask.
Jestli teď momentálně ne, tak já to vykopnu.
There are no questions right now, so maybe I will ask the very first one. I would like to know the concept of liberation happened only within the institution marriage. In the liberation, as you have mentioned, that the equality was represented at the level of marriage, and liberating and was supposed to happen within the marriage institution of the marriage. You know, whatever I have mentioned, it's well known that women could study and work, which is, of course, an integral part of liberating. And that's what is known about the balancing the men and women, or equalizing men and women. All rights in marriage was held by men. Women had no rights whatsoever. Only the communist law from 1950 enabled to women to participate both on the ownership, but also on the decision-making, what the kids will do. Spouses had the same rights, and during the state socialism in the Czech Republic, a majority of Eastern European countries was institutionalized, and many of people have concluded several marriages. As for the marriage in Hungary and other countries, by the end of the socialism was not compulsory, whilst in the Czechoslovakia it was perceived as a compulsory institution. You know, looking at it from today's perspective, it's quite different. Current, we have the freedom, we have all the freedoms. You know, prior to the current period, the institution was set up and fitted within a certain framework. It was compulsory. I would like to ask a question. What was the situation, the dynamism of the 50s, the emancipatory position and more conservative during the 60s and 70s, more conservative approach. Of course, the then Czechoslovakia had a slightly different trajectory to other countries in the Eastern Communist bloc. Could you maybe do a sort of a comparison of the individual countries, or can you see certain parallels concerning the emancipation of women? What's common to the socialist countries is the early pressure on gender nivelization, equalization. Within a couple of first years, the legislation connected to marriage was actually the same. The genders became equal. Within a period of 2 years, the abortion was legalized, with the exception of Eastern Germany and Albania. Eastern Germany, it was 72. In other countries, it was back in 56, during the course 56, 57. These are basic moments. The gender emancipation actually happened in a very similar way and had a similar course in the individual countries, whilst not the sexology and perceived as a field of expertise. Back in the 50s, I've mentioned that there were books published, articles for expertise, whilst this was not the case of other Eastern European countries. In Poland, Hungary and Eastern Germany, they started to explore sexualism back during the 60s and 70s. Whilst during the last 2 decades of the communism, all the countries that definitely valid for East Germany and Hungary, they were much more radical as far as sexuality is concerned. We were very radical at the beginning, at the 50s, but not later. Concerning the marriage, in Hungary, there were books being published which recommended polygamy models during the duration of marriage. So they started to define difference between the sexual fidelity and human fidelity, which was supposed to be perceived. So there were, during the 60s and 70s, there were books where there was one bride and two grooms. The faithfulness was supposed to be at the human level, not at the sexual level. Men and women spouses were supposed to have one afternoon available to dedicate to their own hobbies. This was the openness, openness in marriage perceived in Czechoslovakia. I would say we were really radical back in the 50s, not later. I have one more short question. The sexuality, the 50s, that could maybe follow the change of generation in the 50s. Those people who were accustomed to a typical model, bourgeois model of the First Republic, those who were freed and liberated in the 50s, they have sort of created an opposition to a traditional bourgeois marriage. And then later on, 60s and 70s, there was no need for this sort of liberation. And maybe that could be the reason why they, in a certain way, were returning to what was then perceived as normal or standard. Change of generation is, of course, very important. I was talking about the changing standards, norms. I didn't talk about real life. I mentioned what the advice was given to people and to state and social policy. So the norms and standards, it's one thing, but actual behavior is the other thing. Of course, the real life is always delayed in comparison with the norms and standards. So it's obvious what I mentioned, that the 50s, it was not a living utopia, feminist utopia, with those who were then young or very young. These people we can't usually meet and talk to anymore. I was following the divorces, the rulings on the divorces, and I followed also these rulings from Bratislava and Prague, which was comparable, and I researched these rulings through the whole of socialism. I was looking at the reasons given by people why they want to terminate the marriage. Of course, the reasons changed. People were complaining of different things, and it's very similar in other socialist states. Very soon, more divorce were filed, more applications for divorce were filed by women than men. So we could see a certain level of emancipation because these women were filing the application for divorces who were dissatisfied with their lives, and that leads to what you have said, that in the 70s it was a little better because the curves of divorces would be showing or supporting the idea of a crisis of family and marriage. Whilst I would say that during the course of 70s and 60s, women were more emancipated because they were leaving the marriage, leaving the families when they were not satisfied. You know, women had children, and as we know, the children were, in case of divorce, they were following their mother. So the benefit and allowances were given to the mother. And so she could actually improve her situation by getting rid of a husband whom she didn't like anymore. So that could follow actually your idea of emancipating due to the change of emancipation of due to the change generation. You know, women were not exactly happy having to read the books of Balzac and many other authors, where they were giving them the advice to stay at home and cater for the husbands and children.